Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. So I hope we didn't drown you too much yesterday. Just a couple of reminders. One, we're still going to use the hand raising function and also the question box. So feel free to raise your hand at any point. We're very laid back. We'd rather you interrupt us as we go, just because our trains of thought move along to the next topic. So feel free to raise your hand if you got any questions. If you're not comfortable or just don't feel like talking online, then feel free to also post in the chat box. And I am going to turn it over to Marcia just to do a quick overview of yesterday and see if anybody has any questions.
Hello all. So just real quick, we had mentioned to you the handout section, so we have changed that up today. We took out the blank Lone Mountain exercise for you, the context, and we put that completed one up that I was referring to you yesterday afternoon. So if you want that, that's up there. And then the other thing is we took out the food for thought and we added a life cycle soccer ball example in there. Was there anyone that wanted the food for thought that did not download it yesterday? And if you'll just raise your hand, we'll see how many folks that includes. All righty, so I may make a note. I was about to say keep your hands up, but
Nice.
Just like a regular class. Okay, Chris. And I will send the three of you copies of that via email. All right, so I'm going to put all the hands down. Okay, so just go ahead, Angela.
I was going to say, just so you know, that is also embedded within the design guidance workbook. We just have it broken out for that exercise and for ease of use. But just in case, somebody got missed, it is within the design guidance workbook.
See, I had even forgotten about that. But it's a good document to have separately, so I'll send that out.
Definitely.
So I just wanted to wrap up some of the concepts we discussed yesterday. So the context of the organization, figuring out where your organization fits within that new sustainability theme, the intersection between society, economics, and the environment. And then we rolled into discussing who interested parties might be for your EMS, and then you develop your compliance obligations after looking at those interested parties and their needs and expectations. We reviewed that you develop the scope or decide what within your organization the EMS will cover. You have to develop the policy, and there's certain requirements for the items that you include in there. And then we discussed leadership, the 9 different items that the new standard requires of leadership. And then we discussed real quick roles and responsibilities. So did anybody have any questions on yesterday's content? All right, that's looking like a no, Angela. I don't have any hands raised or anything, so.
Sounds good. Well, then let's move along and get started on today's topics. So today we're going to be talking about the entire planning section. So it's all of the elements that start with 6 point something. So this is like the meat of the standard. Everything else kind of refers to this section along the way. So you're going to spend a lot of time in this world of planning if you have an EMS or if you are just getting started creating an EMS. So let's get started with that. So this is the standard 611. It says the organization shall establish, implement, maintain processes needed to achieve desired outcomes and requirements of the standard. And that when you're planning the EMS, you shall consider the context that Marcia talked about yesterday, compliance obligations, and the scope. So you have to think about those things when you're developing your system. When planning the EMS, your organization shall determine risks and opportunities related to your aspects, which we're going to talk about in a bit, compliance obligations, which we're also going to refer to, and then other issues and requirements that were identified in those sections that were talked about yesterday, 4.1 and 4.2, which is context, interested parties. And okay, so you're wanting to make sure that you're addressing and preventing or reducing undesired effects, and then also achieving continual improvement. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what risks and opportunities are. It's new terminology for this version of the standard. And if you have a copy of the standard, which I hope you guys do, in the back of it is a really good information in the annex. We actually refer to this a lot to give us a little more clarity on what they mean for some of those things. And what's on this slide is actually from the annex within the standard itself that explains a little bit more what they mean when they talk about risks and opportunities, because it's broader than that aspect and impact concept that if you have an EMS in place, particularly if it's based on ISO 14001, that you're used to hearing. So risks and opportunities, it's about potential adverse effects or threats and potential beneficial effects or opportunities. And the organization can have risks and opportunities related to other issues, things that don't have anything to do with environmental topics. But for the purposes of the ISO 14001 standard, it needs to have some touch to the environment. So they give some really great examples here. So an environmental spillage that's due to literacy or language barriers. So maybe your workers couldn't read the signs or couldn't read the work instructions that you had. So maybe that caused an environmental issue, right? But if you go back to the root cause of it, then the root cause is actually a language barrier. Increased flooding. Yes, sir.
Sorry, that sounded like you were taking a pause there.
Yep, it's all good.
Just had a question here concerning risk and opportunities.
Sure.
Where are the recommended places within the EMS to demonstrate consideration for risks and opportunities?
So you only have to document risks and opportunities that you are going to actually do something about, and we'll get to that wording in a minute. But so some of the places we've seen it, of course, we see it in aspects and impacts. You can have a separate list. Like Marsha was talking about yesterday, we had a group of folks do a SWOT. So that's their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So that's, one of those that kind of lends itself to that. So if you use that SWOT method in your overall planning, business threat planning, you can just have meeting minutes that show that, as long as you can find them to refer to them if you have an auditor coming in. So there are lots of different ways. It's whatever works for you in your system. Okay. All right. So some other examples are increased flooding due to climate change that might affect your organization's premises. And so we've seen some of this with our recent hurricanes that have gotten more wet and less windy. And we have a member in our program that actually had water come up and completely surround their plant. And actually floated one of their above ground storage tanks twice last year, whenever the two big hurricanes were, Floyd and Francis and Matthew. So just be aware that that could be an issue that you need to think about when you're thinking about risks and opportunities, this changing climate that we're in. Lack of available resources to maintain an effective environmental management system due to economic constraints. considering the number of shutdowns and limited budgets and things like that going on with COVID, I would think that this might be a risk and opportunity that people are looking at right now. You know, how many people do you actually have that can help you to manage the EMS? Did your budget get cut? You know, maybe you had big plans for like a lighting redo or something like that, and now all of a sudden that money's being pulled back in order to keep people working and that kind of thing. So that could be into your risks and opportunities. You know, it's not directly an environmental thing. It is a capital kind of issue or a resource issue on the people side. However, it has effects on the environment. So you see kind of how risks and opportunities are much broader than that specific environmental impact. Oops. Not every risk and opportunity is required to be included when you're documenting them. There has to be that connection to the environmental management system. So an example would be hazardous waste disposal risks has an obvious connection, but credit card fraud, while it's a risk and your insurance company might have an issue with it, it's not related to the environment that we can specifically see. Now, if you can see some relation to the environment and you can actually document that, then perhaps that is something that you want to include. Like life cycle analysis, a formal risk assessment isn't required, and we'll talk about that life cycle piece in a little while. What it's basically saying is you need to look at things with a life cycle perspective. So that just means kind of with a 10,000-foot look. You want to make sure you're looking at all the different pieces. Same with risks and opportunities. You want to make sure that you're kind of looking at it with that perspective, but you don't have to do any kind of formal risk assessment in order to develop your risks and opportunities and figure out which ones need to be documented. A few examples for risks might be if you had a compliance violation. Some of the risks of having that violation would be legal action or fines or a marred reputation. And you can see that that ties to the environment because it is compliance with an environmental standard, but the risk is not necessarily environmental. You have legal action associated. You might have money that's due because of that. So you can kind of see how risks and opportunities there, again, is broader than just the impact on the environment. And then on the positive side, your opportunities, if you're going above and beyond what your permits require, perhaps that gives you an improved reputation, gives you some positive press, it helps you with your marketing, so things like that. So this is just one example of how risks and opportunities has been incorporated for folks. This is from the zoo. And you see here that they actually included it within their aspects and impact. So this is their aspect and impact chart. And then over here in this column, you have the risks and opportunities that are associated with each aspect, right? So that's one way that folks have decided to do it. Again, this pestle, I think Marcia showed you this yesterday from Firestone. The risks and opportunities are over here in this column, right? So again, it's within their aspect and impact list. They just do it a little bit differently. And then they have their risks and opportunities listed out over here. All right, so just a couple of examples for you. All right. So organizations shall, going back to the standard, determine potential emergency situations, including those that can have an environmental impact, and then they shall maintain documented information on its risks and opportunities that need to be addressed and the processes needed in 611 and 614 to have confidence that they're carried out as planned. So in this new version of the standard, there's a lot of overlap and repetition between various clauses. So all of a sudden you see here that you're supposed to determine what your potential emergency situations are. Later in the standard, it talks about what you're going to do about those emergency situations and planning for them. So we'll talk about that later today, but I just wanted to point out that it's weird how they have split some of these elements up. So, but basically, and I don't think we've mentioned this yet, in our slides, anytime you see the word shall, it means it's something you have to do, that it is auditable within the standard. And so shall means you have to do something. So we have highlighted all of those in red. And anytime that you're required to have something in writing, we have highlighted that in purple italics there. So if you need documented information, it means you need some sort of procedure or a process written down in some way. So this is saying that you have to maintain documented information on that list of risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. So you need to write those down somewhere, somehow. Again, it's up to you what makes the most sense for your system. And then you also need to document how you're going to address those. So that process is needed in 611 and 614 to have the confidence that you're carrying out that process. All right. Environmental aspects. So moving on from risks and opportunities, which is the broad strokes, we're going to get a little bit more specific with aspects. So for those of you who haven't been involved in ISO 14001 before, aspects can be a little hard to wrap your brain around because of that word. It's easier for me to think about environmental impacts. So the impact is what is happening to the environment. It is the air pollution, it is the water pollution, it is the recycled material, it is all of those things, positive and negative, that are affecting the environment. So think of it as cause and effect. The aspect is the cause. What is making that spill? Or that pollution? What is making that land, use be used up? It is what is making something happen. Whereas the impact is the effect. It is what is being worked on. So we'll go in that a little bit more. So just think of aspect as cause and impact as effect. So your organization shall determine the environmental aspects and their associated impacts, considering a life cycle perspective. And life cycle perspective is new to the 2015 version of the standard. When you're determining your aspects, the organization shall take into account change, so any planned or new developments, any new or modified activities, products, or services, abnormal conditions, as well as regularly scheduled conditions, and any reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. All right. So let's talk a little bit about life cycle perspective, because it is completely new to the standard. So there are typical stages of life cycle. There are many, many different versions of this, but the ones we look at kind of go through design, raw material acquisition, production, transportation, delivery, use, end-of-life treatment, and disposal. So when you're thinking about developing your list of aspects, think about the impacts that you can have. So when you're thinking about that from a life cycle perspective, in design, what can you do to make your product less impactful, either during its production or in its final stages, or even just in its use? So some things you can think about are raw materials needed. Can you use renewable resources? Can you reduce the need for hazardous materials in the production or in its final breakdown process? Can you use recycled content materials? In the designing for the manufacturing process, is it an additive or a subtractive? In other words, are you doing some sort of 3D printing, or are you going to have to remove material afterwards? Like if you do a punch press or something and you need to clean up the edges or something like that, which is removing material, or you're cutting out something from a larger sheet and then the waste from that sheet. So that's one thing you could potentially look at for a design consideration. If it's a subtractive, which is that that removal process, do you have it optimized in order to remove the minimum amount of material? So you're wasting less, right? You're just basically trying to reduce that material consumption in the first place. It's very much pollution prevention, which is our bread and butter in this division. Can you lower the energy needs when you're designing? So we've had some folks re-engineer their paint processes with a different paint that actually requires lower heat to cure. So that is lowering the amount of energy needed for that manufacturing process. Ease the end of life treatment. So can the materials you're using, can different types be easily separated? That is like the bane of our recycling world's existence, is having two materials that are different, stuck together in a way that they cannot be easily separated from each other to be recycled. And therefore, those two pieces of material, which separately could be recycled, are going into the landfill because they can't be taken apart easily, or it takes too much time, or it's just not physically possible. Can the product be reused in whole or in part by another process? So we have a facility that uses a dye, and they use the same dye multiple times, and as it wears down, they'll take that dye, and instead of just recycling the whole dye, which is a big metal piece, they will use it. They'll take the biggest one and they will do a process on it to remanufacture it to be a slightly smaller size. So they're removing some material, but not nearly as much as having to create a whole new dye, right? And then they'll use that one until it gets worn down, and then they'll do the same thing for the next size down, and they keep doing that until they get to the smallest part that they make. So that's one way that you can think about easing end-of-life treatment on a production part, not even necessarily the widget that you're making, right? And then finally, can the product be recycled or composted? The example I like about this one is there was a greeting card company that implanted wildflower seeds in the paper. And so, most people will just, recycle their card, throw it in the recycling, but these folks had made it so that it was compostable and you could just plant it and you get pretty wildflowers. So that's, just one more little thing you can look at when you're designing things in. And some of these things you really can't do after the fact. You have to think about them on the very front end. All right. So does anybody have any other examples of where things have been designed in thinking about the environmental impacts later? Okay, not seeing any hands or comments. All right, so the next life cycle phase that we're going to talk about is raw material acquisition. So when you're thinking about raw materials, again, some of this has to be done during the design phase, but some of it does come down to the vendor selection. So are there less toxic materials that could be substituted for ones that were originally designed, but maybe there's been some technology shift and you're now able to use a less toxic material? Could you receive items in bulk versus in small packages in order to reduce the amount of physical containers that need to be dealt with? Is the packaging used on your raw materials, can it be returned, or is it at least recyclable? So we have a facility that went from these 1 kilogram bottles of a coating material up to 55-gallon drums that are then pumped into a clean room versus the smaller containers being kept in the clean room. And then those 55-gallon drums can be sent back to the company that produces that coating and refilled. So they'll refill them over and over and over again, and those drums just keep going back and forth between the user and the vendor. So think about things like that in order to reduce waste. Does a material require a higher energy demand than some substitute? Like I was talking about with the paint that was recently re-engineered. Does a material require a higher water demand? than a substitute, whether that's in its initial phase or maybe in the cleanup phase. Does the usage of a material require additional treatment in some way? In other words, can you use something that doesn't require an additional step like wastewater pretreatment? So think about things like that when you're talking about raw materials that you're looking to purchase. Can a material be filtered or treated and then reused? So we have a lot of folks that have solvent filtration systems, or they have somebody come on site and treat solvents to be reused. So that's something you could potentially look at for your raw material. Does anybody have any other examples they can think of on this level of the life cycle? Okay. Production. So for those of you that have an EMS in place already, this is probably the things you already have in your aspect and impact list. It's typically the things that you think about when you're thinking about manufacturing, but you might not be a manufacturer, so you might have fallen into one of these other categories already. So some things to think about in production if you haven't already. So what products are being made? What materials do you use to make them? What types of wastes and discharges are generated? So look at your inputs and your outputs. What type of contractors, vendors, and suppliers do you have on site? What do you do off-site? Do you do any deliveries or servicing of your product? Where are you located? Are there any specific rules or regulations that you have to follow that are local ordinances? What permits or regulations do you have? Those are usually where people start. You know, they have this regulatory requirement to do something, and therefore it's the first thing that goes on the list. What fuels or other energy sources are you using? And then how much of those are you using? So start setting those baselines. How water is used in their process. You know, do you just have sanitary sewer, or do you actually use water in the process itself? And then how much of each are those? And are they separated? We had a facility that actually their sanitary sewer was somehow tied into one of their rinsing processes or something. And so they ended up having to take their samples for their water quality after where they were mixed instead of before, just because of the way their POTW was requiring that. So think about those kinds of things. And then what about wastewater? You know, what's coming out? And, you know, do you have to do any pretreatment and all of that to that? So all of those, and I'm sure there's a ton more production considerations. So any questions or additional examples for the production side? Okay, so next step, we have transportation delivery considerations. So when you're thinking about those kinds of things, you need to look at what products, raw materials, and wastes you're actually moving around. What air emissions might be coming, including GHGs. You know, just because it's leaving your site, it doesn't mean that the emissions stop. So those trucks have air emissions. Those forklifts sometimes have air emissions, things like that. So think about, you know, what your impact is even on the delivery side. Hazardous waste spills, a lot of times those happen in moving a material from here to there. Even if I mean, when we're talking about transportation delivery, we're not just talking about when it leaves your site, we're also talking about moving it around on your site. So don't forget those fork trucks when you're thinking about transportation. You're transporting stuff inside your building or from your building to your hazardous waste storage area. So think about those kinds of things. Traffic accidents. If you own the fleet, then you're probably going to be responsible for dealing with any outputs from a traffic accident. So keep those in mind when you're thinking about those risks and opportunities and aspects and impacts. Fluid leaks. So even if you don't own your fleet, if you have trucks coming on your site, you might have somebody blow an oil line or a hydraulic line or something like that on your site. So what kinds of things do you need to put in place to prevent that from becoming an issue? Do you have mats that you put over your storm drains in order to keep mats or booms or something that keeps that fluid from getting into the stormwater? Do you have secondary containment around your dock area that keeps everything flowing into a pit that pumps that you can pump out versus having to send it to stormwater or something like that? So think about those kinds of things too, even if it's not your even if you don't own the vehicle that's coming on site. What are you going to do to prevent those environmental impacts? Parts damage due to shifting, packaging, or corrosion, etc. So you might not think that this is necessarily an environmental thing. You might think it's more of a quality thing, but every part that you have to recycle because it's not right or manufacture, those are materials that you're having to use. So you are actually, having to buy more materials in order to do that. You're having to pay somebody to recycle it or rework that piece of material. So everything that you have to do, it requires more natural resources. It requires more treatment on the back end, all of that. So quality is very much a part of the environmental management system too. So you should be working in tandem with your quality management system. If you have a 9000, whether that's in an ISO 9000 or one of the other quality systems that's out there for cars or planes or whatever. And then, of course, don't forget those fork trucks, emissions, damage, and things like that. So anybody think of any other examples on the transportation delivery side? Okay. Use. So this is use of your product. What kind of impacts might you have? Does your product require energy use or water usage or waste materials? What kind of packaging do you use? Think about all of those things when you're trying to develop your aspects and impacts list, right? And also in the design phase. So how can you reduce that need on the back end? And then finally, we have end of life and treatment and disposal. So can the design of the product be changed in order to make recycling easier? Can you reduce that composite material thing that we talked about during the design phase? Do you have a take back program? We have several facilities, particularly in the electronic side, that are required to have take back programs, and then they have to recycle the materials. So do you have one of those? Have you thought about that and how you can actually design your product so that when you take it back, it can be easily recycled? And then does the product inherently break down into something compostable, recyclable, or reusable in some way? All right, so hopefully that gives you kind of a better idea of what we're talking about when we talk about life cycle perspective. In the past, people just pretty much focused on that production piece, but really you have a little bit more control over this entire life cycle than you might have originally thought. Even if the control or influence is about talking to your folks that actually do the design or talking to your vendors and your customers about their requirements of you in order to kind of work together and reduce the impact overall. Okay, so we have an example from EPA, and I want to show that to you. Marcia found these a few years ago, and I don't think they're up on their website anymore. But we have several of them, but this is the one that is the most applicable. I think the other one is an old cell phone, like a flip phone, and then there's like a CD or DVD. But people still use soccer balls. So we'll just show you this one just to kind of give you an overview of a life cycle kind of deal. So you've got the soccer ball, you've got to gather the materials to make the soccer ball, then you have to prepare those in some way. Then you put them all together. Then they have to deliver it to you. So getting that soccer ball to you, using the ball, and then how to get rid of the ball. And so this is just one quick and easy flow that you can read yourself. This is in the handout, so you can download it and actually look at it. It prints in a large format. And then on the back side, it's got some additional little fun facts and stuff. I don't know how out of date they are, but it's a nice little thing if you're just trying to wrap your brain around life cycle. All right. So again, that is in the handouts for you. All right. Now, let's do a quick little exercise. So in the handouts, you'll see a risks and opportunities exercises document. So there are multiple exercises within this one document. So go ahead and download that and open it up. But we're going to do this first one here. And we're going to talk about thinking about those aspects that you might have, those impacts that you might have in each life cycle stage, right? So I'm going to give you about 5 to 10 minutes. I want you to think about each stage of the life cycle here. And then for each stage, think about your particular process and what type of environmental impacts you might have at each one of these design stages. If you don't have any control or influence at all over a particular stage, just put NA there, it's fine. And then we'll move on. We just want you to have that perspective. Remember, you just need to think about what you might be able to do at each one of these stages. All right. So let's see. It's 1:36. So let's give you until 1:43, and we will come back and talk about what you guys came up with. All right. Okay, so raise your hand if you need a little bit more time. All right. So does anybody want to share what kind of environmental impact you came up with for design? Did anybody come up with any? Okay. What about the acquisition of raw materials? Do any of you have control over your raw materials?
Hey, Angela.
Yes.
I actually thought of something for design and then a question just popped in. But
Okay.
for design, think about those prototypes,
Mm-hmm.
physical prototypes of things. So
Mm-hmm.
just as a thought.
Absolutely, especially if you can make them out of something that's more easily recyclable, maybe, especially in that early phase when you're just kind of doing proof of concept kinds of things. Yep.
And then let's see here. They thought about the need for NEPA assessment.
Oh, yeah. Good. Good deal.
Or during that design phase, even thinking about any potential permits that may need to be acquired, doing
Mm-hmm.
the design, let alone once that product is in production.
Yeah, that's definitely things you need to think about. It's not necessarily an aspect per se, but it's definitely a risk and opportunity that you need to keep in mind. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So what about the others? Does anybody want to share any of them, even if it's production or transportation? What other kind of examples of impacts did you guys come up with?
Just a reminder, if you raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can speak, or you can type those into the chat. And we got one here for, let's see, raw materials. Use alumina for a raw material, requires less energy, etc.
Okay, good. So you've thought about, the types of materials that you can use in order to create your product. Great. That's a good example.
Yep. And Angela, we've got Leanne with her hand raised.
Okay.
Although Leanne, you've got your phone is muted. It says I'm seeing that you won't be unmuted until you enter your PIN. So I don't know if you want to type your comment into the chat box, Leanne, because I can't unmute you.
So while she's doing that, we got another comment in using recycled material versus raw, which was similar to the one prior, but is that, and I failed to read the rest of it, was using alumina instead of bauxite. So if you're making something, yeah.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Yep. So that is less energy demand. Yeah, and as far as being able to use recycled materials into your product, we have some folks that actually will take in processed recycled materials and mix it back in, particularly with plastics and things, and out of their molding process, they can chip it up and reuse it back in, or metals that can be reinserted into the process. Paper, we've seen folks in our paper industries be able to reuse some of the pulp that would otherwise be waste. They can add some of it back into the process depending on the quality of paper they're making. So yeah, there are lots of options in that realm. Okay. Any others?
You have two more in here.
Yeah.
Oh, did you have a hand raised too, Marcia?
No, I was just going to let you know that Leanne got hers into the question box.
Gotcha.
Oh,
yes,
good.
yes. So during delivery, using an MEK chemical, there's potential for spill or leaks. A UMA employee must be present.
Good.
Then we got another one for raw materials, having green purchasing practices, choosing less toxic chemicals, which actually you just sent something out earlier, even in regards to cleaning chemicals for COVID, with the greener chemicals for that as well.
Right, using EPA's safer choice method of choosing chemicals that are less impactful. Maybe not impactful, but at least less
Right.
impactful.
Yeah, less toxic. And for those of you who are not ESI members, that's one of the benefits of being a member, is that went out on our listserv that goes between both our members and also our waste reduction partners, staff.
Yeah, and that list you had found it at turi.org.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, they're the toxic underwriters. Oh God, I can't remember what the acronym is.
That's okay.
They specialize in greening cleaning, and they're based out of UMass Lowell. So they had taken the list N, which is the list that EPA reviewed of products that are approved for pesticidal use on viruses, and so they reviewed that against COVID-19, and they came up with a list of those that could be used. And then Turi took that, used EPA's safer choice guidelines, and came up with ones that are healthier and less toxic to the environment.
Yep. Yep.
So 3 just came in for production during the production phase.
Awesome.
Energy consumption and its impact on carbon emissions,
Mm-hmm.
which they later clarified could be true for others as well, other
Absolutely.
stages.
Of course, yes. Yeah.
And then another production, identify uses for byproducts and by other companies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've had facilities that, their byproducts are the inputs for other companies, and they've been able to make those connections and sell that as a raw material versus having to dispose of it as a hazardous waste. So yes, that's a great resource.
And
Okay.
the last one is utilize waste heat recovery in the manufacturing process.
Have you been talking to them, Scott? Combined heat and power is something I've heard out of Scott's mouth.
Or CHP, as it's known as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Absolutely. All right. So it sounds like you guys have at least thought through the first few phases. Some of the later ones, it's hard, when your product goes out in the world, to think about how people are actually going to use it in all of its forms, and whether or not you have to do something about that on the back end. But just remember that it's life cycle perspective. It is not a life cycle analysis. So just make sure that you've thought about all of these phases when you're developing your aspects and impacts list. All right. So speaking of aspects and impacts, so if you scroll down in that Word document, there's another exercise right after it. You'll see that. All right. We're going to actually do this one a little bit later, but just keep this document open, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. All right. So for right now, though, I'm going to go back to the presentation and get through a few more slides before we do that. So, all right. So now that you've defined your aspects and your impact, so you know what you're putting out there, the organization shall determine those aspects that can have a significant environmental impact by using established criteria. So in the 2004 version, the older version of the standard, it required you to define what your significant aspects were, but it didn't give you any real guidance about how to do that. So the new standard actually requires that you use this established criteria, and then you need to document what that is. So the organization shall communicate your significant aspects among the various levels and functions of your organization as appropriate. And then the organization shall maintain that documented information. So you need that record of information somehow, whether that's the process or a record of it or whatever. But you need that documented information of your environmental aspects and impacts. So what is that environmental aspect list? The criteria that you use to determine what the significant aspects are, and then the significant aspects themselves. And if you're an ESI member, we use some documents and we'll shorthand the significant environmental aspect as SEA. And that kind of throws people sometimes the first time they see it. So if you see us write SEA, we're talking about your significant aspects. So here's just one example of a criteria for that ranking. So you could do this, as you can see, you pick a category and then you define what that category means in a high, medium, and low method. So we're just looking at a 1 to 3 scale, right? And then you choose however many of these you want to use. We suggest no less than 3. When you get above 5, it starts to get really complicated, but you can use as many of them as you want to try and give yourself a good ranking of your criteria, so of your aspects. So this is just one method, and you can see that it specifically defines what each of those numbers means, so that someone who wasn't involved in the process could come in and at least understand where you got your numbers from.
Angela, a question just came in.
Sure.
Is established criteria something that is established by the EMS working group, or is it some kind of third-party consensus standard to follow that may be based on an industry standard?
It's a good question.
Read that again too.
No, it's okay. I think I understand what they're saying. It's up to your particular operation how that's going to happen. So if you have corporate that says you will use this criteria to rank by, then you use corporate's ranking. If you have an industrial user group of some sort that provides you with that ranking criteria, then you can choose to use that and go along with that process. But in the end, it is up to you and your group to decide what you're going to use as far as your ranking criteria goes. It's what makes the most sense for your system. It's how you are really going to decide which of these aspects that you've defined are really the biggest ones for you, instead of the aspects that rise to the top by somebody else's ranking and may not actually have the biggest impact on your specific facility. All right, so just always do that gut check when you're using other people's criteria, that it really does make sense for your system. All right.
Yeah, and then I would just add, and you may say this in a little bit, so it spells out those established criteria, because sometimes with the old standard, folks were like, a group was getting together and they were making a decision about what was significant, whereas now you have to have some sort of ranking system so that if staff changes, the new staff will get the same answer as the current staff.
Yeah, it's about being able to replicate that number and not have it just pulled out of the air. So it also helps you avoid that flavor of the month kind of thing that we try to avoid in continuous improvement, which is, you want to make sure that it makes sense over time and not just at the present moment. So. All right, here's just another example. This is the one that the zoo at least used to use. I'm not sure if it's still the one that they use since the upgrade, but basically they had these 3: severity, frequency, and quantity. And then they actually, from before, we had the low, medium, high, but now they have a none. So if there's no impact, then they have a way to kind of zero that out instead of having to go with 1 as their lowest. Another example, this one came from GKN way back in the day. Again, I don't know if it's still in use, but what I liked about this one is, it adds both a 0 and a 5, so you've got a lot more variety of options for you. But then also, if you look under this regulated, it's a yes, no. So it's either a 0 or a 5, and you can make that a 1 or a 3 or whatever, your numbering system, you can call it what you want. So just be aware that just because you have criteria defined in one format for a specific criteria, like frequency is 0 to 5, it doesn't have to be that for all criteria. So again, it's either regulated or it's not. So it's a 0 or a 5, not all the whole range. So you can manipulate your ranking criteria any way that you need to that makes sense. All right. So any questions before we move on to compliance obligations? Everybody kind of understand aspects, impacts, and ranking. Okay, it's clear as mud now. It will get worse when you leave this place, I promise. If you have any questions, just holler at some point. We'll talk about it again tomorrow at the beginning. If overnight you start thinking about it going, what did she say? So, all right, so Dawn, compliance obligations. You want to talk about this?
Yes, indeed. Okay, can everyone see 6.1.3 compliance obligations?
We can see it.
Okay, great. If so, let's jump into it. Let me move this. Now, with the new standard, it states that the organization shall determine and have access to the compliance obligations related to its environmental aspects. Also, the organization shall determine how these compliance obligations apply to the organization. And the organization shall take these compliance obligations into account when establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving its EMS. Also, another big one, the organization shall maintain documented information, okay? Documented information of its compliance obligations. Now, there's really only two minor things that have changed with this clause since the 2004 standard. The standard no longer requires a procedure for identifying compliance obligations. It, of course, is still a good idea, but is no longer required as per the standard. Noted from the standard, quote, in addition to the documented information required in specific clauses, an organization may choose to create additional documented information for purposes of transparency, accountability, continuity, consistency, training, or ease in auditing, end quote. This is one of those cases where, for the purpose of consistency, it might be beneficial to keep a procedure in place for identifying compliance obligations. Now, the standard no longer refers to legal and other, and instead calls them all compliance obligations. I'll repeat that. The standard no longer refers to legal and other, and instead calls them all compliance obligations. Speaking of which, compliance obligations. They shall include legal environmental requirements that an organization has to comply with and other environmental requirements to which an organization chooses to comply. Compliance obligations can arise from applicable laws and regulation or voluntary commitments stemming from the needs of interested parties. I'm sure you've all have dealt with that as regarding interested parties. Now, legal requirements can encompass a broad range of topics and can originate from many regulatory agencies across the board, including federal, state, local, international. Many of the examples that you see here include Clean Air Amendment Act, the Clean Water Act, RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, the Hazardous Materials Transportation Act, your EPCRA, Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act, and subsequently the Toxics Release Inventory, your Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, your National Historical Preservation Act, NEPA and SEPA, your National and State Environmental Policy Acts, your Endangered Species Act, and oil spill prevention. Now, EPA's oil spill prevention program includes the Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasure Plan, and also the Facility Response Plan. We also include permit requirements, limits, and reporting requirements, executive orders, your Atomic Energy Act or Energy Policy Act, local restrictions such as pretreatment permits, grading permits, etc., Superfund or other cleanup agreements, operator or laboratory certification requirements. Additional legal requirements, well, they can include your transformers, your Toxic Substances Control Act, or your polychlorinated biphenyl site revitalization guidance, nursing stations throughout hospitals for medical waste, your grounds irrigation for local water restrictions, pesticide application, other North Carolina certified applicators, aquatic, etc. Your heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. For your certified technicians for refrigerant recovery. Fluorescent lights, about mercury recovery in your universal waste. Computer monitors, electronics landfill ban, that's been really relevant the last few years. Other local landfill bans include cardboard, wooden pallets, plastic bottles, it goes on. And of course, other compliance obligations, which include your ISO 14001 commitments, ESI or other voluntary programs, business programs, your corporate mandates, customer requirements, another big one, supplier requirements, industry standards, contractual agreements, agreements with communities or NGOs, voluntary labeling or environmental commitments, and insurance, including FEMA. Now, if you take a look at this, it's a rock quarry, right? I believe this is in Raleigh. And some questions to pose. And I have some additional comments afterwards, but anybody wants to chime in on this, please raise your hand or send it through the question box. First, who might be interested parties for this rock quarry? Okay. What might be their needs and expectations? What compliance obligations might the quarry voluntarily take on as a result of the needs and expectations of these interested parties? Now, this quarry only blasts during the daytime when most residents are not home, trying to be a good neighbor, perhaps. They have voluntarily taken this on and has become one of their compliance obligations. Now, note on that, compliance obligations from voluntary commitments can change. Okay, by taking on this voluntary commitment, you are not bound to it until the end of time. Right? Policy, rules, regs, commitments, they all change. It's in flux. But it's always nice to be proactive and take on a voluntary commitment such as this. If anybody has any further questions or comments on this, feel free.
Hey, Don.
Yes.
We had a kind of a thought on the first who might be interested, residential neighbors.
Exactly, being a good neighbor. And, dusting throughout the neighborhood, noises, vibrations, cracked foundations, environmental impacts. Exactly, I agree. How about the infrastructure? Heavy trucking on the roads? Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for that comment. Okay. Anybody
Also,
else wants
mine
to
safety.
Oh,
Sorry. Mine safety
go ahead.
or OSHA. Yep.
Yeah, definitely. It's huge. I live locally, not too far away from Aurora in Beaufort County. Huge mining process, phosphate mining. And they are very, huge operation, and they actually ensure that the secondary roads around the mining operation are moved as their mining advances. There's actually even a DOT ferry terminal nearby, and they make sure that access is always available. And it's while it's a rural community, a lot of folks live around there. Now, what amazes me about that's a rural setting. This one is an urban setting in Raleigh. So they have to be even more conscientious. Great. We can always come back to this if anybody else has any further thoughts. So keeping current with changing regulations. Now this is a relatively fresh thought on my mind from my inspection days just a couple of years ago. A facility registered for an EPA ID number through RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, which I mentioned a few slides ago. And then when I show up for an inspection, first inspection in a little while, so I showed up in a role of a compliance assistance inspection. And I'm glad I did, because they had no idea that their program was out of date. And they were confused as why nobody reached out to them to keep them up to date on the rules and regs that have changed throughout the years. I got them up to date on that and show them how they could keep up to date on that. But I also explained to them, if you're going to enter into a program, whether voluntary or involuntary, end of the day, it's up to you to keep tabs on these things. So we resolved the issues, came back in a few months for our official inspection, everything's fine. But it also was a learning opportunity. And I was able to show them resources on both the EPA level and the state level, where, I told them, set up a schedule for yourself, check for new rules and regulatory changes. And especially in that program, hazardous waste, it occurs quite often. They could check through the local inspectors, the division within DEQ, the RCRA website through EPA. So with that said, how will your organization keep current with changing regulations and compliance obligations? Some of these things I've mentioned, but subscribe to an update service or get updates from individual trade groups. Attend trainings through NCOMA, NCDEQ, EPA webinars. Check the regulatory websites. They're out there, easy to find. And again, if you're not sure, if you can't find them, we are here to assist you, whether it's through DEEC, CSI, or DEQ regulatory agencies. We'll help you find out where you can find these websites at. You can join a regulatory listserv, contact a DEEC's Environmental Assistance Coordinator, hire a consultant if possible. There's the NC State Industry Expansion Solutions. If one's in place, refer to a corporate legal team. And as I mentioned, create a tracking reminder system. Create a compliance calendar, task reminders, etc. Now, all this is not a requirement of the standard, but it is necessary for compliance evaluation, and it is indeed implied. Again, any questions on this, we are here to help you. We can put you in direct contact with the regulatory side, or we'll be the middle person and help you out and bridge that gap and find some information for you. Now, here's an example for a tracking log. Again, this is not cookie cutter. We're not chefs, well, not in the environmental sense. So you can format this in any way that will fit your facility needs. Like you see, start with your compliance obligation title. In this case, it's for a stormwater permit. There's the driver, the regulatory agency. In this case, DEQ's Daimler. What citation and link? Well, 40 CFR 122.26. A general description of the compliance obligation. There's more than one set of eyes may be utilizing this. In this case, it's a stormwater outfall discharge, monitoring stormwater pollution prevention plan, maintaining your stormwater best management practices. What's the trigger? Is a permit required, etc.? Environmental aspects. In this case, stormwater runoff. And then we'll transition over to some summary of controls, the location of guidance documents and resources, monitoring requirements. What's the due date on all this? The frequency of your reporting, and that's a big one. If you fall out of touch of changing permits, you may find yourself in violation for not, you may be sampling and reporting, but you may not be doing it on the newest schedule that's required. I would come across that quite a bit. Somebody was using a permit that was 3-4 years out of date. they were doing their job, but they just weren't aware of the new requirements. Documents and records are required to be maintained. And again, it's something to be updated periodically, because things do change. Different set of eyes may be looking at this. So keep it up to date as much as possible for other people that may be viewing it. Okay. And with this, looks like we're going back into another exercise, risk and opportunities.
All right, so I've got this one. Let me change the presenter right quick.
Okay.
Show. All right, can you see my screen?
I can.
Awesome. All right, so we're going to go back to that exercise sheet that I asked you to open earlier. And you might also want to open in the handouts the aspects exercise form. And what that looks like is this spreadsheet. You can use this, or you can use just the Word document and put your information in here. But we wanted to give you this because it's a nice, concise way for you to track your aspects and impacts. So it gives you a place to put in your aspect, mark whether or not it's within any of those life cycle stages. So you've got documentation of that. You can put in your areas or departments where that occurs. You know, that way if you have an aspect that occurs in multiple areas or departments, you just put a little X in that column and you've got it across the board. Then you talk about the impacts or potential impacts of that aspect. And if you keep scrolling to the right, it gives you the place where you can input your ranking criteria and then what those numbers are. And then you can figure out whatever method of math you want to use. And that is totally up to you. You can add things across, you can multiply them, you can do some sort of weighting ranking. So maybe something is twice as valuable as something else within your criteria. So you do whatever math algebra that you want to do, and then you can put that total number here and then rank them so that your highest ones are on top. Then you decide which ones, where your cutoff's going to be. So that could be wherever you see the first gap between the numbers. It can be that you define your top 5 are all significant. You can make that determination of what is going to be determined as significant, but you need to document what that cutoff is going to be. All right. And then we also have folks that use adequacy of controls in order to reduce the impact. So let's say you have something that if it was completely uncontrolled would definitely be very serious. However, you have really good controls on that, whether that is engineered controls or whether that is procedures that you have in place or other means that you have it controlled, right? And then you can give that a number and actually subtract it out or divide it or whatever, so that you can actually have things move. Remember, this is all about continual improvement. And if you never can move your lower ranked aspects up to be significant and reduce the significance of those that are higher ranked, are you truly making improvements? So think about those kinds of things. And this is just one way that you can show it. It doesn't mean you're getting rid of that aspect. It just means that you have it under control and can work on something else, right? And then you say yes or no. Is it significant, so that it's very clear to anybody looking at this spreadsheet. Then there's a column where you can list those risks and opportunities, and then just a column that if you have any other general comments about that particular aspect that you can put. So it's just a really concise spreadsheet that holds a ton of information. It is not a requirement, but feel free to use it if it's helpful for you. But going back to the exercise, we're going to have you do a little bit of impact and aspect. So to me, it's always easier to think about the impact. So whether that's water pollution or air pollution or landfill usage or anything like that, it's easier for me to think about that first and then figure out what caused it. So I always think about the impact first and then go back to the aspect. If it's easier for you to think about the aspect and the cause first and then what the impacts of that can be, then feel free to do this in the other direction. It's fine. Whatever makes the most sense for you. So what we're going to do here, you're going to list any associated environmental aspects or causes for at least 3 of the impacts that you identified above. So remember this exercise we did earlier for the life cycle? So you define some impacts up here. So pick 3, any 3, and define what the aspect, so what is the cause of those impacts that you came up with, right? And then just type those into these boxes, or you can put them into that spreadsheet that I just showed you. And then once you've done that, come down here and take those 3 aspects that you came up with. You can just transfer them down here, or you can just skip this part and put the risks and opportunities, but you need to know which ones they go with, so you might have to rewrite them. And determine what risks and opportunities beyond the aspect itself, beyond that environmental piece, what are the other risks and opportunities associated with that aspect and impact, all right? Does everything make sense? And then you can transfer it into that spreadsheet if you like. I'm not going to make you do that, but it's there if you want to do that. All right. Does anybody have any questions on what I'm asking you to do? I see a comment blinking over here. Okay. All right. So I'm going to give you, let's say, I'm going to give you until 2:30, and if you need a break to go use the restroom or grab a drink or something, feel free to go ahead and do that at this time too. If we need to extend it a couple more minutes at the end, it'll be fine. All right. So, but I don't want you to feel like you're trapped at your desk. All right. So we'll give you till 2:30 for that. Okay, raise your hand if you need a few more minutes. All right, seeing none, let's move on. So does anybody want to share an aspect, impact, risk, or opportunity that they came up with for their process? Do anybody have any questions on how to develop these?
Looks like we have a hand raised.
Okay.
Going to unmute.
Thanks, Scott. I looked away and there was nothing, and then I came back and I was like, oh, there's one.
Yeah, I have questions on how to develop these aspects and impacts.
Okay. So what specifically are you having trouble with?
Just the process of brainstorming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is an overview class, and we go a lot more into this when we do our module series, and we spend an entire day on aspects and impacts and all of that. But there are lots of methods that you can do. What we start with is what we call an internal environmental review. And it gives you tons of places where you can start looking for what environmental impacts your facility might have. And then once you've got your impacts, then you start thinking, okay, well, what's going to cause this impact? And that's what your aspect is. It talks about impacts being what interacts with the environment, and aspects being what interacts, and then the impact being the actual event that occurs. So one's a verb and one's a description. It just goes a lot more into that. You can get a lot more information on that particular process if you open the design guidance and look at those steps within the design guidance. And then I can help you individually too. So I don't know if that helped much, but it's an in-depth topic.
Yeah, it is. I'm going to review the design document a little bit more detail just to get some more practical.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you have any questions, just shoot me an email later, and we can talk more about that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. What else do we
had a couple in the question box here. So thinking about again the soccer ball. So rubber waste is a potential opportunity to find a recycling company instead of sending it to landfill.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And then aspect could be energy resources or water sources, and the impact could be depletion of natural resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. Was that the same person? Or was that something different?
Different person, sorry.
Gotcha. No, that's okay. I was trying to figure out how they related, but okay.
And then another aspect could be fleet vehicle use, or landscaping, fuel consumption. Impact is consumption of fuel, or I guess more the impact would be air pollution or yeah.
It can be also a reduction of natural resources, because petroleum comes from the ground, and has other impacts as well. So yeah. Is that it? Good job. All right, we'll go back to the presentation piece. It's the last exercise for today. You guys can breathe easier now. All right. So once you've defined what your aspects and impacts are going to be, and all of those risks and opportunities that you're going to act on, and you know what your compliance obligations are, all of those tied together, you have to take action to address those. So you're specifically required by the standard to take action to address those significant environmental aspects, the compliance obligations that you define. And remember, that's not just legal, it also is all those other obligations that you have put on yourself, or that corporate has put onto you, or that you have voluntarily agreed to be a part of. Like for us, for the ESI, we always like to remind our members that the fact that they have agreed to submit an annual report in order to be a part of our program, that is actually a compliance obligation. While there is no legal obligation for you to do that, you have agreed to do that by becoming a member of our program. So that then becomes a compliance obligation. I wish they had not used that word compliance, because in our world of DEQ, and some of us on the line are from EPA, compliance is very specific to regulatory. But in the ISO standard, when they say compliance obligations, they're talking about more than just that regulatory obligation. And then there's risks and opportunities. So if you defined a risks and opportunity in your list, wherever you're keeping that list, it means that you have to take action on that risk and opportunity. All right. So then you also have to plan how you're going to integrate and implement those actions into your EMS or other business functions. And evaluate the effectiveness of those actions. So all of those things are shall statements within the ISO standard. So don't just gloss over this piece. You actually are required to do these things. So for those of you that define your list of aspects as all of them being significant, or a very large number being significant, remember that you have to take action on all of those. All of the risks and opportunities that you define or identify are the ones that you have to take action on, right? So keep that in mind. I'm not telling you not to define them, I'm just telling you to be aware. All right, organizations shall consider, when planning those actions, technological options, financial, operational, and business requirements. So the standard used to say that you could take these into consideration when you're developing your ranking system and that kind of thing. But now it says you shall consider those things when planning how you're going to react to each of these topics, right? So you need to think about what technological options there are. You need to think about, the business case for improving the environment. And most of us do that anyway, because it's the way to our managers' hearts and their pocketbooks. We have to show the business case for our environmental projects. So that shouldn't be something crazy out of the woods for you. All right, environmental objectives. So we're moving on. So we've talked about all the risks and opportunities piece now. Aspects and impacts, compliance obligations. Does anybody have any questions on all of that before we move on to your environmental goals? Okay. So environmental objectives. The organization shall establish environmental objectives. This used to be called objectives and targets in the older versions of the standard. It was always really hard to explain what the difference between an objective and a target is, because they're synonyms. So I'm kind of glad they changed the wording on this one. But basically what we're talking about here is setting your environmental goals. So the organization shall establish environmental objectives at relevant functions and levels, and taking into account your significant environmental aspects, any associated compliance obligations, and then considering your risks and opportunities. So all those things that we just defined have to be looked at when you are developing your objectives, all right? The environmental objectives shall be consistent with your policy, measurable if practicable. So you guys, unless you've been in one of my classes before, have not yet heard me preach about practicable versus practical. So when we took our lead auditor class, our teacher, both times that I've had it with her, so I took it with the same person for the 2004 version and the 2015 version, and they made it very clear that there is a difference between practicable and practical. So I always try to also make it very clear. Practicable means if it is at all possible. So it should be measurable if it is at all possible. Practical means if it's convenient, right? So when you're setting your goals, if it is at all possible, make it a measurable goal. Now, that doesn't mean that every goal has to be a percentage-based goal. So I'm going to reduce energy by 5%. Yes, that's great. That is absolutely measurable, and we love those kinds of goals. However, you can also have a measurable goal measuring your progress towards completion of something. So what percent complete are you to implementing an EMS? You know, how many of those elements have you implemented? If you can measure your progress, it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical number, but you can somehow put some numerical value on that, you know. I don't know if that's making sense, but I just want you to be aware that having something be measurable doesn't necessarily hamstring you in the types of goals you write. It's more about how you write that goal and showing progress. It's all about that progress towards that continual improvement piece. So your objectives also have to be monitored, communicated, and updated as appropriate. And then you shall maintain documented information on those objectives. So how many of you have heard of SMART goals? Well, a good many of us now, that's the way our reviews are set up. You know, our managers work with us and we create these goals, and then we're measured against those goals. But if you look at the requirements of an environmental objective in the new standard, if you set up your objectives as SMART goals, then you're pretty much meeting all the requirements of the standard. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable or achievable, I've seen it both ways, relevant, and time-bound. So when we're talking about that, if it's specific, you want to think about what do you want to achieve, why do you want to achieve it, where are you actually going to implement this, how are you going to implement it, when is it going to be done, and then identify any other requirements or restraints that are going to be specific to that particular target. Measurable. Can you identify when you're going to reach your goal? Do you have concrete evidence? Again, it's all about that progress piece. Do you have access to parameters that you're going to measure your goal by? Have you established a baseline yet? What units of measurement are you going to use? And that's one of my pet peeves, is make sure you don't switch units of measurement mid-goal. So if you're reporting in pounds from the beginning, report in pounds at the end. If you're reporting in tons at the beginning, report in tons at the end. Don't convert over in the middle. It just makes your data harder to follow. It's harder to do trends and that kind of thing. And are you going to normalize your data? So are you going to compare it to the amount of production or the time or the amount of resources needed, so cost, those kinds of things. Normalizing your data can help you show that you're still making an improvement even though you might be increasing or ramping up your production, right? So if you can keep your, for example, energy, if you can keep your energy level even while increasing your production, then if you compare that energy level to that production, then it actually shows that you're decreasing your energy demand per part. Hope that makes sense. It's hard to describe without, you know, you seeing my hands move everywhere, which is what they do. All right. Other measurable things to take into account are where are they located. So a lot of times you'll find training records in human resources, you'll find purchasing records, cost of contractors, negotiated contracts, cost of materials, all in your purchasing department. Maintenance typically holds your preventive repairs and things like that. Your accounting folks typically have your actual costs, any paid invoices. A lot of times they're where you're going to find your utility bills. So if you have an energy or a water goal, you're probably going to have to go find your accountant people to get those numbers in order to track those goals. If you have a compliance officer, they're probably the ones who are holding your regulatory requirements, those permits, the reports that are due, any testing requirements that you might have. They're all going to be probably with that compliance officer. And then production or quality might have your scrap rates. So remember what I said, you should be working hand in hand with your quality folks anyway, because any poor quality is actually going to fall on the environmental folks to deal with, both in the in bringing in new extra materials and getting rid of the bad ones on the backside. Attainable. So moving on to the A in SMART. That's about setting goals that are realistic and challenging, and that can help you strike a balance between aiming too high or making goals that are too easy. So both of those can actually cause a lack of interest and involvement in the process by the folks that are actually going to be working towards those goals. Having a stretch goal that takes time to accomplish is different than having goals that can never be reached. So an example of that is zero waste to landfill. We have a lot of folks in our program that are striving towards that goal. However, when you first set a zero waste to landfill goal, it can seem really daunting. So maybe you have blue sky goals that say, okay, we're going to make zero waste to landfill in 10 years, right? But what you're working towards is breaking that down into, okay, we're going to try and get to 50% this year. And next year, we're going to try and get to 75%. And then the year after that, we're going to try and get to 85% until you get to that 100% of landfill avoidance. Does that make sense? So if it seems too large, you just want to try and communicate it in smaller steps so that you're not overwhelming the folks that are going to have to actually accomplish this goal. And then relevance. So does the goal match your company's philosophy, mission, statement, policy? Is it part of your corporate culture? Is it customer driven? A lot of times goals that are customer driven get a little bit more focus from management. And does it improve efficiency? Does it save you time or money? Does it improve your relationship with the community? In other words, you need to think about your risks and opportunities in that, and your interested parties and context. All right, and then finally, and this one seems to be one of the things that our members miss when they're submitting their annual reports a lot of times is, are they time bound? Make sure you set deadlines for when you're actually going to accomplish these goals. And it's okay to have goals that are 3 or 5 years out. It's actually great. But you can also have them that are for 1 year so that you can show progress over a year. So again, feel free to make a big goal that's like a 5-year goal and then break it down into 1-year increments so that you can show that progress over time. All right. You also want to make sure that your deadlines are realistic and flexible. So if something goes wrong, if we have a pandemic, then you might need to adjust your goal deadlines. You might need to push out the dates that things are due. You might need to make changes. And it's perfectly fine in the ISO system to make changes to your goals. You just need to document that you've done it and why you've done it. We have a really good form that I don't think is in here, and I can attach that for next time, that shows you it records all the steps that you're taking towards achieving these goals, but at the bottom it also has a place for you to record changes that you made to the goal over time. So you have that record of that change. And then do you have a way to follow up to make sure that the people that you've assigned things to are doing them, that the actions that you're taking are actually effective, and all of that. So make sure that all of that is taken into account. Okay, so Some things that you might want to set goals to do. You might want to investigate or study something. So an example of that would be studying the feasibility of reusing gray water, and then having a deadline set to actually report out on that study. You might want to control or maintain. So an example of that would be to maintain your stormwater compliance with 0 violations by the end of the year. By the way, for our members, particularly those at our rising steward and our steward level, which are the 2 higher levels, compliance is assumed as like a very the low bar of that group. And so compliance goals, while we know you all are committed to being in compliance, we don't see having a goal of compliance as an actual objective for continual improvement. So just keep that in mind. It's definitely something that is needed and definitely at our partner level, which is an assistance level, good to see. But when you start moving up in the program, again, you want to move beyond those compliance goals and start looking beyond compliance, right? You're doing more than just the minimum to be in compliance. You might want to set goals to develop an EMS. So some of you might be on this webinar to hear a little bit more about what that is. So your objective might be to implement an EMS with a third-party registration or with an ESI functionally equivalent audit, and then set a date when you're going to get that done. A lot of times if you don't set that time-bound date, give yourself a deadline, it makes it a lot harder to find the time to put all the pieces in place in order to achieve that goal. You might set a goal to improve your EMS. So maybe you have an objective to streamline your contingency plan to make it more user-friendly, and then make sure you set a date by when that's going to happen. You also might want to set goals to improve your environmental performance. We love these goals, particularly if you can get those percentages in there, because it helps us. We are partially funded by an EPA grant, and part of that requires us to submit annual reports as well. So we take the data that is submitted to us by our members, and we add up all those numbers and then send an aggregated report off to EPA. And so if you can give us numbers that we can add up with other people's numbers, it makes our lives so much easier. So we love to see this. It's also a concrete set of topics that we can perform some assistance with. So reducing electricity, Scott, who's on the call and helping with our Q&A, has become our electricity, our energy use kind of czar here in our division. He's helping do all kinds of training and assistance with that. Our waste reduction partners also help with energy and water and solid waste audits and things like that. And so those are very specific kinds of assistance that we can offer. So it's nice when we can see goals that are associated with that and see the fruits of our actions. All right. You might want to set goals to improve your environmental performance. So maybe you want to increase the volume of your recycled materials by 50%. And you can tell these slides are slightly old, in calendar year 2018 from your 2015 baseline. So having that baseline set is also important so that you know if you're making progress. So here are some examples. Not all of them are SMART. So I think we should probably do this by hand raising. So raise your hand if you think replace all lighting in the warehouse by the end of 2017 is SMART. What kind of numbers are we seeing, Marcia?
We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 folks.
All right. So what I'll say is no, it's not SMART. It is time bound, but it's not specific. What are you going to replace the lighting in the warehouse with? Are you going to go from LEDs to high bay lights, or are you going to go, yeah, so just be a little bit more specific in that goal. All right, so let's try another one. This one should be easy. How about increase recycling? Is that smart? Raise your hand if you think it's smart.
All right, so we've got just one person that's raised their hand.
All right. While it's noble, it's not a SMART goal. It's not specific really. While it is measurable, you don't have a baseline. It's probably attainable, but it's definitely not time bound. So there are just a lot of things that could make that a more functional goal for you, right? You might want to say increase recycling from 20 something odd baseline by 50% by the end of 2020, you know? So it's how you write it will help you in your management of that goal, all right? So let's see, we'll try one more. How about the bottom one there? Divert 98% of solid waste from going to the landfill annually. Is that one smart? Raise your hand if you think it's smart.
Two. Another hand go up. They're multiplying. About 7 folks said yes.
All right. Well, I would argue that that one is smart. We're talking about diverting waste from the landfill. They have a very specific percentage of that waste. And then it is time bound because they say annually. So they're measuring this every year. So I'd love to hear, if you didn't think that that was a SMART goal, what concerned you about it? Because I'm always up for being argued out of an answer.
All right. Let's see. Chris, you had your hand up, but I don't think I unmuted. Okay. Kent, go ahead. You should be unmuted.
Oh, I was just lowering my playing with my. I don't want to answer him.
I know, it's fun tools.
I think it is smart. I'm sorry.
Awesome. No, you're good. It's all good.
Oh, so Chris, you unmuted yourself and then you muted yourself back. So
It's okay.
you
I'll
should
let
be
you
able to
mute
talk
me.
now.
Yeah, I'll let you go ahead and mute me. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, you're
That's
fine.
okay.
You're fine.
I didn't know whether you wanted to chat. Okay, Bruce has got his hand raised. Bruce, you should be good to go. Unmuted. Are you there, Bruce?
He did write in the chat box.
Okay.
So if we can't get any audio from him,
Okay. Well, what did he share with us via the chat box, Scott?
sure. So I think I know what he's saying, but tonnage or reduction level. So it
So
is 98%, but 98% of what?
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, you could definitely make it more clear what you're going to be using as far as your measurement. So yeah, you could probably argue me out of it if you tried hard enough.
And then Sydney has a couple comments here. So there's a few here. So she does think it's a SMART goal, but it is a bit unclear if they're saying 98% per year, or if the end goal is to reach 98% over the next X number of years. So she definitely leans towards the former. And she says it just seems like 98% is a lot to do each year.
So that's where our zero waste to landfill goals come in. But yes, absolutely. So we have a lot of folks that are actually in that 95 to 98% solid waste to landfill avoidance. I will say that a lot of them use waste to energy as the means to get there. So some folks don't necessarily believe in that as a viable method for reducing landfill waste, but you know, we don't judge. We help people with all the tools that are out there.
So there was another comment in here, you know, just kind of pointing back to SMART goals. So define when it will be accomplished.
Yes.
So that one, the 98% one.
Yeah. So that word annually there, to me says they're going to do that 98% every single year. Now,
Yes.
did I misinterpret it? Maybe. You know, maybe they wrote it unclearly and it came out as a SMART goal. So yes, again, like I said, you could probably argue me out of my decisions pretty easily, but I'm glad that you're kind of thinking through each one of those steps. All right. Were there any more, Scott?
Nope. But to me, that one definitely needs to be rewritten, because it seems to me like every year they're going to be 98% less than the year prior.
Okay, I don't see that, but again, you can argue with me later.
I know where you sit.
I know you do. All right. All right, so moving on. All right, so once you've figured out what your goals are going to be, then you have to plan your actions for achieving them. All right, so in the old standard, this was called your program. We had a lot of people that we have found over the years that didn't understand what program meant. So I'm kind of glad they've changed the wording, although it is kind of clunky. But basically what they're saying is once you've decided what that goal is going to be, you need to figure out what steps you're going to take in order to achieve that goal. So the standard actually says when planning how to achieve your objective, the organization shall determine what will be done, what resources are going to be required, who's responsible, when it's going to be completed, and how the results are going to be evaluated, including what you're going to monitor. And then the organization shall consider how those actions to achieve the objectives can be integrated into your business processes. So how are you going to make that goal part of your culture? You know, how can you make sure that not only is that goal achieved for this part of the facility, but for the entire facility or the entire corporate structure, right? How can you share that and make sure that what you've learned from it is propagated across the entire structure? And then how can the actions be integrated? So the location, organization-wide, or is it only going to apply to a specific department, unit, or activity? It may depend on the location of your significant aspects or the action step that you're taking. And then site-wide goals, they tend to increase your involvement and your visibility, right? Your employees, make sure that you involve them early. Are you going to use just some of your employees? Or are you going to try and do something that affects everybody just to get everybody on board? A lot of folks will start with a recycling goal because that's something that pretty much is across the board. Everybody can do and should do within your facility. And so that gets everybody kind of on board with helping with your goals. And then you can dig into some more things that are specific to one process versus another process, like reducing water in a specific process or reducing energy on a specific process. Although those can also be large goals that are across the board, is just the actions taken are different for each different area. You want them to you want to involve your employees in order to create a sense of ownership. It helps to foster their buy-in of your implementing this program. And then communicate your expectations. Make sure they know, you know, put up charts that show their progress over time. Create fun little competitions between different areas so that there's something at stake, you know, whether it's a pizza party or a golden broom or, you know, whatever it is, to help you achieve those goals and get your employees motivated and involved. And then you might want to consider linking an achievement of your environmental goals to your business goals and other rewards programs you might have. There's lots of examples of integrating your goals across the entire facility or the entire organization. Some of those might be, having management meetings on the floor more frequently than annual. We'll talk about management review in a couple days, but typically facilities will have management review once a year. We've seen them do them quarterly, and we've seen them do them monthly, and we've seen them do them biannually, and it all kind of depends on the facility or the organization itself, what makes the most sense as far as how can you get more people involved and active. And remember now that leadership is required to support those middle managers in supporting the EMS. You might have integration of that management review meeting for environmental progress with other business programs. So you might have an integrated management review meeting with quality and environmental together, or you might have those on the floor meetings that addresses environmental, safety, morale, quality. I can't remember all the different ones, but I've seen lots of boards out on the floor of manufacturing plants where the managers will all go and have that meeting out on the floor talking about all the different parts that come into play in making that part and getting it out the door safely and happily to the customers. Integration of your environmental goals with other business goals. In other words, using that triple bottom line approach might be something that a facility would look at. And the triple bottom line is, let's see, it's society, so that's that social involvement as well as environmental and the cost of doing business. So it's business as well as environment and social. All right. You might look at the frequency and type of communications that you're making to your employees regarding the progress on your goals. Sometimes people put up charts or have displays on closed circuit television kinds of things. Sometimes they're promoted in all hands meetings. Sometimes it's an email. Sometimes it's a newsletter of sorts. So there are lots of ways that you can get that information out to your employees. You might develop departmental goals that are related to environmental issues, and then once that department proves the proof of concept, then you can transfer that to a similar department or another department with slightly different actions to meet the goal. All right, so there's several ways that you can look at that integration requirement that's within the standard now that didn't used to be there. All right, that's it for today. What kind of questions do we have out there? Do we have any?
So we don't have any hands raised, and Scott has cleared everything that I see in the questions box.
Except for one, Bruce was asking, is the slide current? And I don't know if he meant a prior slide.
This one? Is that current? Yeah.
I don't know, maybe we can, was Bruce having the audio issue earlier? Can we unmute him?
Bruce, you're unmuted if you'd like to provide clarification. Oh, he wrote in the question box, previous, yes.
Yeah, so the new standard requires integration, which it didn't before. So we just try and give some examples of what that might be. Interestingly enough, for those of you who are not familiar with the ESI program, our stewards, that's one of the 4 criteria that they have to meet in order to become a steward. And that used to be, because it wasn't part of the environmental management system, a higher bar. But now it requires anybody who puts an ISO 14001 system in place to integrate their environmental achievements across the board, so and across their business function. So we're going to have to think of a higher bar for our stewards, apparently.
Yes.
Any other questions? All right. Well, I'm glad today did not take as long as I feared it might, because it's a big chunk of the standard. Like I said, a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about tomorrow and the next day are actually going to revolve around the things that we talked about today. Remember, this is the planning section, so all of these things are going to tie into all of those action items later. Remember, we're in a plan, do, check, act cycle. So yesterday we did that framework piece, which could also be part of planning. Today we talked about the planning piece. Over the next couple of days, we're going to talk about the do, check, and act pieces. So we're going to be building on the all of this work that we're putting in at the base level over the next couple of days. So, all righty.
A question just came in.
Sure.
Do any companies have retreats to brainstorm?
Yes.
Would you like to talk about a service that we provide?
Sure. Do you want to talk about it, since
No,
you took advantage of it when you were out in the real world? So, several of us have gone through facilitation training through a program called TOP. And we can actually come out and help if you choose to do that. So Scott, in his previous life just before this one, but after his life with us before that, asked me to come out and facilitate a brainstorming
strategic planning session.
There you go, strategic planning for their environmental goals, specifically at the facility that he was with at the time. So we can absolutely do that. And sometimes it helps to have an outsider come in, because with facilitation, it's really hard to both facilitate the conversation and participate in the conversation. So yeah, absolutely. Lots of facilities do some form of strategic planning. A lot of them will take off, and go somewhere else outside and do a retreat. But yeah, for our members that are interested, we can absolutely come and help with that facilitation piece sometime when we can finally actually travel again.
Yes.
We've never done that digitally, so if anyone wants to be a guinea pig, we can.
Oh, yeah, we're all about doing the virtual thing right now, but you just have to bear with it. All right. Anything else from anybody? Okay, so tomorrow, same bat time, CBAT channel, same link that you used. We are going to talk about resources, competence, awareness, so basically that training piece, communication, documentation and document control, and then operational control. So those aren't super long things to talk about, so it probably won't be a really long day, just to let you know, which is good. All right. I do have the recording from yesterday, so I will send that out to you in a little while, along with the slides from yesterday. And I will also, I was gonna say, I will also send you a copy of that form I was talking about with the objectives, and then I'll attach it for tomorrow as well.
And I've sent out the food for thought for the folks that I saw they had their hand raised. So if there's anything else someone needs, let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to email us anytime, any of us, and we can help you with the understanding of the EMS, but also the development of it.
Do we have a slide with our contact info? I was just thinking about that.
I don't think so.
We'll make sure we get that before class ends. We're so used to giving this in person, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah. Good idea. We will do that. Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Well, we will talk to you all tomorrow. Have a good rest of your afternoon. And thank you all for your participation and responding. It's hard to have this class in person when we can see your heads nodding. It's even harder when we can't see that. So thank you for your participation. All right. So we'll talk to you tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone.